You know, Stussy, Union, and Supreme. Three brands that I regard as being the blueprint and the pillars to modern day streetwear. But did you know these three brands are also connected? Curious how they're connected? Let's discuss next here on Making the Brand. What's up, everybody? Rob Norman here from Planet Brooklyn Academy, and this is Making the Brand, the series where I give you a little knowledge on how to start a clothing line, and if you already have one, how to make it better. As always, please hit that like and subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date with everything I drop when it drops. So at the top of the show, I mentioned to you about how Stussy, Union, Supreme are the pillars of streetwear and basically the blueprint for it. But in order to understand how these brands are all connected, you kind of need to go back and do a little history about these brands. So let's start with Stussy. So Stussy, as you guys all know, Stussy started out on the West Coast in California in Orange County back in the early 80s. And Sean Stussy, the founder of it, was a surfer. And basically from surfing, skaters caught on to it and they all adopted the brand. And it was huge on the West Coast. Now, Sean Stussy also had a partner named Frank Sinatra Jr. No connection to the singer, but that was his partner. And the two of them blew Stussy up to what it is today. Now, back in the 80s and early 90s when Stussy was really blowing up, the thing is, there was no internet. So whatever was going on the West Coast, nobody on the East Coast really had a clue, and pretty much vice versa. Me being on the East Coast, growing up here in New York City, especially Brooklyn, I knew about Stussy because I was a skater, and Stussy ran ads in all the skate magazines. But most people did not know what Stussy was. During this time of the 90s, you're talking about urban fashion. So you talk about a time when FUBU, Karl Kani, Cross Colors, and Nietzsche, these brands were huge, and they basically ran the fashion scene. But if you were someone like me who didn't want to wear what everybody else was wearing, you're looking for these very unique brands. And there weren't many stores around New York City that carried them. And Stussy was a brand that you could find in New York City, but basically they were in specialty stores. So you would find them in like Bloomingdale's, whereas in California, you would find them in Fred Siegel's. So, but you know, going to a big department store like, you know, Bloomingdale's wasn't my thing. I didn't go in there. It wasn't catered to me. So I didn't like going to those stores, especially being a skater. You like to go into these more smaller mom and pop stores. So in the 90s, 89, basically 89, 90, Union opened. Now, for those of you who believe that Union LA is the first and only store, you're wrong. Union NYC was the first Union store. It opened here on Spring Street down in Soho. I used to always go past it because I used to actually run a spot on Friday nights called Shaman's, which was on West Broadway and Spring Street, right around the corner from Union. I used to always go to the Union shop because they had all the dopest stuff, all the stuff that you never heard about that weren't in the mainstream stores. Now, the interesting thing about Union was that three people ran Union, basically. The main person who ran Union was James Jebbia. Now, that name sounds familiar to you. That's because James Jebbia is the creator and founder of Supreme. So before he even started Supreme, he started Union NYC. And he had two partners, Marianne and Eddie. And they ran the Union store, and they carried a lot of brands that were sold outside of the US, a lot of British, European brands. But they also had a lot of like hip brands that were from like California. So you had brands like Extra Large, you had brands like Fresh Jive that was from overseas, Stash, which was Futura's line, PNB Nation, and of course, Stussy. And I always loved to go there and get my Stussy gear and everything else. But what also made this store, Union, so special was that Union used to play a lot of hip hop music in their store. Now, when I say that, you guys are probably thinking like, what store did it? Nowadays, that's common. But back in the days, most stores played everything you heard on the radio and basically top 40 or a curated radio station type format. Union was playing stuff that you normally did not hear on the radio. It was a lot of underground stuff, remixes to songs, hip hop songs that you didn't know existed. I'm pretty sure Union is the place that I first heard Eminem on a mixtape. But it was such a cool vibe in there. Like, you heard all this cool stuff. They had so much cool clothing, and it was just cool to be around in the store and hang out and kick it with people in there. So that's why Union had such a cult following there. And again, I always went there to buy my stuff, get my Stussy stuff. Now, as I said before, Stussy only sold most of their stuff wholesale to bigger stores. They eventually sold this stuff to Union. And what happened was, after they started selling in Union, they started to take up more space in Union, because I noticed like there was more Stussy product in Union. Eventually, they would open their own store on Prince Street, which was like one street over and down a few blocks. But they would open it. Now, here's the funny thing. Union, being run by James Jebbia, James would partner with Sean Stussy to open the first Stussy store, which was the one on Prince. So James had his hand in Union and now helping Stussy open their first store. And he ran that first store. And while he was running that store and had Union, he was making a lot of things happen. Now, a lot of the stuff that you know Supreme to do today, James did a lot of that stuff, basically test marketed it with Stussy out of that Stussy store. So limited releases and special releases, a lot of that came out of Stussy. And James rolled that into Supreme when he started Supreme. But while James is doing this, he has Eddie open up the Stussy Union store in LA. So this is when Union LA opens up. So Union LA opens up in early 90s, before 95, it opens up in the early 90s. So Union LA opens up. So there's a Union LA and then there's a Union NYC. And while Eddie opens that store up, if a lot of you guys remember back then, if you were around during that time, you know that Union LA and Stussy shared one store. And basically half of the store was Stussy, half the store was Union. Eventually, Stussy would get big enough that they would separate the stores, and then Stussy would have its own store and Union would have their own store. By this time, when all of this happens and Eddie is running things, James Jebbia would leave to start Supreme. And that's around 1994. And then 2 years after that, Sean Stussy would step down from Stussy. He basically felt that he ran his course of doing everything he wanted to do and no longer wanted to be a part of it. So his partner Frank took over. And then they just continued to keep expanding Stussy, and it kept blowing up. Now, at the time that they're blowing up, Supreme starts to blow up. And at the same time, Union and Stussy in LA are doing big things. Eventually, Eddie would sell Union to a Chris Gibbs. And Chris Gibbs, funny enough, was a worker in the Union store in New York City when he was much younger. So it's kind of a full circle thing to work at a store and then eventually buy out the store and run it and own it later on. So currently Chris is doing that. But before all this, let's back up a little bit about Eddie. Now, as I said, Eddie would come out to LA and launch the Union and Stussy store and run it. But there's a certain point where he realized that sneakers were becoming a big thing. This is before really like the sneaker trend and, reselling, all this, before that started. He was pretty pivotal in this part of introducing sneakers into Union. And I'm condensing the story, but long story short, he would see a market for selling sneakers at a higher price, very unique ones. But he didn't have the inside connects that he needed to really get in with Nike and all of them. So he needed a partner. So he met his partner, who happened to be called James Bond. That's his name. James was from the East Coast, had opened up a store in LA and was doing his business there. And him and Eddie became friends and they partnered. They would partner to form Undefeated. So you see why I say these brands are all the pillars of streetwear, because they are the forefathers of this streetwear thing. First of all, Stussy, we all know, is the godfather of streetwear. But then after that, when you see how they got introduced to the New York City scene by Union, and that being James Jebbia, and then James Jebbia going on to launch Supreme, and then Eddie going on to expand Union and then go on to launch Undefeated. And it can go much deeper, because even if you look at the people who are running Supreme, many of them left from there to start their own lines. So it's kind of a continuation of everybody who's learned from the previous ones. So if you're looking to start a clothing brand, you really need to know your history. A lot of guys I've seen of recent years have not been big into like learning history. They just kind of just want to jump into it, make money. And a lot of these brands don't last because of the fact that they don't understand the history, how streetwear was birthed. Because all this stuff I just told you that was happening in the 90s, it wasn't called streetwear. There was no name for this. We just knew it was something underground that was not part of the mainstream. It eventually became streetwear by 2005, 6. That's when the name was stamped on it, streetwear. But before that, it didn't have a name. It was just underground. It was related to hip hop. It was cutting edge. It was people just doing what they enjoyed doing, making creative product, which wasn't out there to the masses. But yet they laid the groundwork for everyone who preceded them. And this is what you got to know. So I kind of wanted to share that with you guys today to show why these brands are the pillars of streetwear, why they're the blueprints, why you need to know this, why they are all connected, and why they make hip hop and streetwear so much bigger over the last 30 years. So again, I enjoy giving you guys this info and sharing this with you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this. As always, please like and subscribe. And also, if you haven't gotten my new book, get my book, Making the Brand. Again, another book on the blueprint, showing you how to build a well-structured clothing brand. Everything from the ground up. So get the book. I'll leave the description, leave information in the description for you guys. And until the next episode, peace.